So there I was, back around 2010 or so, and I was getting into role-playing games for the first time. Until then, I had largely regarded the genre with disinterest, feeling that it was a bit too number-crunchy compared to the sort of games I usually played. The three games that really got me into RPGs were Dragon Age Origins, Mass Effect, and the subject of this video, Oblivion, the fourth entry in Bethesda's Elder Scrolls series. Up to that point, I knew virtually nothing about these games, and when I first sat down to play it, I was genuinely blown away by how much freedom the game appeared to offer. It was a truly open world where I could go anywhere, do anything, and be any character that I wanted to be. And since this was my first step into the world of the Elder Scrolls, I was barraged with lore that I was completely ignorant of. Who are the Nine Divines? What are the Daedra? What is the Emperor of? What is the realm of Oblivion exactly? Who were the aliens? That might sound like a confusing experience, but I always enjoy the feeling I get whenever a game just throws me into a fantasy world and expects me to figure out what's going on, instead of just spelling things out for me in codex entries or cutscenes. Of course, it wasn't long before the cracks in Oblivion began to show. There was the broken leveling system that required you to play in an extremely unintuitive way if you didn't want to get weaker than enemies as you gained levels. There was the often insultingly unrewarding loot that you'd get after clearing a dungeon. There was the fact that archery involved running backwards while slowly transforming your enemy into a pincushion. There were the ridiculous-looking faces, and of course the numerous glitches and general jankiness we've all come to expect from Bethesda games. But look, the flaws of Oblivion have already been enumerated many times over, and this video isn't about the game's failings, but where it succeeds. Of the Windows-based Elder Scrolls games, Oblivion has often been regarded as the neglected middle child. Its story lacks the esoteric weirdness and literary ambitions of Morrowind, and the combat lacks the visceral quality of Skyrim. But if that's the case, then why do I keep coming back to it so often? And the answer to that question is that Oblivion is just cozy in a way that other games in this series aren't. Morrowind had you trekking across an alien landscape, getting yourself mixed up in a story that began thousands of years ago. But the problem with alien worlds is that they're, well, alienating. Your character was an outlander in a province that didn't much care for outlanders, and a lot of NPCs would rather that you go back to wherever it is you came from. Skyrim's world was cold and harsh, emphasized by the game's desaturated color palette, and the inhabitants of Skyrim were often rude, hostile, abrasive, or simply had massive chips on their shoulder about something. But Oblivion? It made the province of Cyrodiil feel welcoming, a place you might actually want to spend time in. Consider the Imperial City, for example. With its white marble walls and the massive white gold tower, it really makes you feel like you're in the very center of Tamrielic civilization. The streets are clean and bright, and are constantly being patrolled by guards day and night. Most of the NPCs you talk to are polite, even pleasant, and that goes for the guards too. The impression you get is that this is a functioning society with strong institutions and the rule of law. Sure, things like poverty and corruption certainly exist, but they are not the defining qualities of this world. And when you do step outside the city gates, what do you find? A lush, vibrant expanse of green fields and forests, with the trees and grass swaying gently in the wind. The landscapes of Oblivion are saturated in warm, pastel colors, and at times it reminds me of old Technicolor films like The Wizard of Oz. Whether it's the lush, verdant hills of the Great Forest, the golden fields of the Imperial Reserve, or the towering Jarrow Mountains, every place in Cyrodiil feels inviting, that the game is happy to have you, and that it wants you to explore its world. And the cities themselves are likewise diverse, ranging from the log cabins of Bruma, the timber-framed houses of Shadenhall, or the colorful buildings that line the streets of Leowyn. Even the game's much-maligned faces have their own goofy charm to them. Sure, the way the camera zooms in on them highlights how ridiculous they look, but at the same time, these faces are also impressively expressive for a game release in 2006. It makes Oblivion feel like a fever dream, but in a good way, and reinforces the notion that we are not in reality, but in a fantasy world far removed from our own. One of the more exhausting aspects of the discourse surrounding fantasy settings is that, like clockwork, it tends to bring out a bunch of pedantic nerds who act as though they all have PhDs in medieval studies, and who insist that fantasy ought to hew as close as possible to their own distorted understanding of the Middle Ages, which is that everything and everyone ought to be drab, dirty, and miserable all the time. Setting aside the absurd notion that fantasy ought to be realistic, the Middle Ages could be surprisingly colorful, perhaps more so than the cold and sterile aesthetics of the modern world. When you combine all this with the game's calming, relaxing soundtrack, what you end up with is a world that just feels pleasant to be in, to the point where I honestly think that the game has the wrong story for the atmosphere it's trying to evoke. Having a world-threatening crisis doesn't really fit with Oblivion's cozy atmosphere. If Bethesda had some artistic ambition, they could have written a story similar to that of Ultima 4, Quest of the Avatar, where there is no great evil to destroy, and the aim instead is simply to live a moral life. Oblivion gives us a place where you could just as easily sit yourself by a warm fire with a flagon of ale in your hand than you could going hacking and slashing through some dungeon somewhere. And speaking of which, there are darker, grimmer places in Cyrodiil, of course, and there are plenty of crypts, caves, and ruins filled with bandits, undead, or worse. But for the most part, these places are off the beaten path, and you have to go looking for trouble if you want to find it. In fact, the main roads are patrolled by guards, something you won't find in Morrowind or Skyrim. Simply put, the impression I get is that this is a world worth saving. One of the reasons I found so many fantasy RPGs of the 2010s so alienating was that they'd expect you to care deeply about their worlds, and then proceeded to make their worlds and those who inhabited them so unpleasant and repugnant that I simply couldn't care about any of it. Oblivion dates from a time before a bunch of people decided that they couldn't take things seriously unless they were grey and miserable. I know there was a backlash against what people called generic fantasy settings, and I understand the disappointment that Cyrodiil lacked the weirdness of Morrowind, but there is also something to be said for that which is comforting and familiar. And evidently a lot of people feel the same way because there's an insanely ambitious modding project called Skyblivion that seeks to recreate Oblivion using Skyrim's engine. Now, I will admit that I'm always skeptical of these grand modding campaigns, as they often fizzle out and die after contributors realize that they'll have to spend months or years working on something with no promise of financial compensation. But Skyblivion is already well on its way to completion, slated for a 2025 release. Will it capture the same cozy feeling of the original? Only time will tell. Until then, keep those swords sharp, those spells ready, and stay out of sight of the ever-watchful city guards.
Stop right there, criminal scum! Nobody breaks the law on my watch! I confiscate